Hi, my name is Jonathan Movroydis. I'm Director of Communications at the Richard Nixon Foundation. I'm standing here in the East Room at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, where moments ago I spoke with Bruce Herschensohn, Deputy Special Assistant to President Nixon. Herschensohn's a renowned foreign policy scholar, a best-selling author, professor at Pepperdine University, and was a very close confidant to President Nixon. He sat down with us to discuss the current global crises, from the Middle East and China to Russia and the Ukraine. He also spoke to us about President Obama's recent decision to reduce troop totals to under pre-World War II levels, as well as the overall federal defense budget. This was all said in the vein of What Would Nixon Do? This is the first of an In Conversation series on Nixon TV. Enjoy. The Obama administration this week proposed a Pentagon budget that would significantly reduce troop size of the military to pre-World War II levels. With the world embroiled in conflict, what would President Nixon do today?
President Nixon would increase the budget for the military, not decrease it. What President Obama has done is made it to pre-World War II levels for the Army. Even other reductions for the Navy, other reductions for the U.S. Air Force. What he is doing is taking our entire military and placing it in as though the budget of the United States was going to drive what the military does. It should be exactly the opposite. The Constitution says the government of the United States will be, let me say it exactly as the Constitution does without paraphrasing. The Constitution of the United States calls for the government maintaining the defense of the United States. It doesn't say in accord with what you would like for the budget. In short, the budget should be driven first by what we need to defend ourselves and defend our allies. Then, when you have that taken care of, you can do all the kinds of things that you want to with what is left over. I think a case in point would be World War II. In World War II, the last budget of a full year. It was the fiscal year. You started in July in those days. So it was July 1st through June the 30th. July 1st of 1944, June the 30th of 45. The budget was constructed in this way. 89.5% of the budget went to the military. War effort, as it was called then. 89.5%. 10.5% was used for everything else from the federal government. I was a little kid, but boy, I don't recall anyone that was complaining. That's the way it was. We wanted to win the war. Victory was the only end. It was not ending a war, it was being victorious in a war. And that is the only way that it should be, and I am positive that if President Nixon were making decisions today, that would be his answer to you.
By the end of the Vietnam War in 1973, President Nixon had established an all-volunteer force. With troop reduction in the current force, in the event of a major threat or catastrophe, could we be in danger of scrambling for what Nixon dreaded, a draft system with less qualified personnel defending America?
Yes. If worse gets to worse, yes. I mean, unless someone presents another alternative, if worse gets to worse. Right now, the all-volunteer services are working tremendously well, really tremendously well. I can't speak for the amount of those who are in the military, because that has to be an answer that's given to you by a commander in the field. I just can't do it. But I do know that the reputation that has been gained from our service personnel in Iraq and Afghanistan, everyone speaks of it as just the best there could be. They'll say the best of all time. Now, I don't know if it's the best of all time. Everyone is different, everything is different, but by God, it sure is good. And yes, I think if it comes to it, if need be, if the need is for a draft, then there should be a draft. And I am sure that President Nixon would say pretty much the same thing. It isn't something that you want, it isn't something that you desire, but it's something that, if necessary, you do it.
Russia has been big in the news lately. They've been a huge backer of Syria. They've taken in National Security Administration leaker Edward Snowden, National Security Agency leaker Edward Snowden. They've just, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, has just basked in the Sochi Winter Olympic Games, and now that he's feuding with the European Union over the future of Ukraine. What do you think President Nixon would do in all this, with all this posturing by Russia?
I don't think it would have gotten to that position if it was President Nixon that was in the White House. I don't think that President Putin would be as antagonistic as he is, because President Nixon was tremendously respected, even by President Brezhnev at the time of the Soviet Union, very respected. And I can't say liked or that there was a terrific friendship, there wasn't, but there was a respect from President Brezhnev. And I don't see that kind of respect given to the current president. I just don't see it. Now, maybe I'm wrong, maybe he does. Maybe Putin respects President Obama. I'm not there. But I certainly don't see any evidence of that, nor have I heard of anyone who would have been in a situation where he would have seen the two together speaking about the respect that's paid to President Obama. And when you speak of the particular places that of significance that President Putin has taken the opposite position of President Obama or of the United States, I do not believe that President Nixon would ever have let it get that far. Let me just cite right now where we stand in the world. It used to be, and not very long ago, that when any nation was in trouble, they would look to the United States and say, where does the U.S. stand? They would hope that America would come in and rescue them. In a sense, we were like the old cowboy movies of the cavalry's coming to free the people who were under some authoritarian in the Old West. And we sort of had that role. And anyone who traveled overseas during those years, particularly the Cold War years, has seen evidence of that. Doesn't happen anymore. Look what happened in the Ukraine. It was between the military conflict. I shouldn't use the term military conflict. There were two sides, I'll put it that way, East and West. East, that certainly wanted to have Russia as its ally. The West that wanted to have the EU, the European Union, as its ally. And in the East, the people speak Russian. In the West, they speak Ukrainian. Quite different. No one asked for the U.S. It was between the European Union and Russia. There was no Oval Office address by President Obama, as I think there might have been with President Nixon or other presidents. Then you get to the negotiations that are going on with Iran over their nuclear facilities. It isn't the U.S. U.S. is just a small part of it. It's what is called in diplomatic terms P5+1, the permanent members of the United Nations plus Germany. So you got six people, six entities there, 6 nations. We're just one of them, which I think is what President Obama sort of likes, I guess. With Syria, the strong man is Ban Ki-moon, who is, of course, the Secretary General of the UN. These kinds of things make a great difference because I think there is memory, and it isn't that long ago, where in Iran, the people demonstrated against their own government. Boy, that's really something when you have a totalitarian government like the Ayatollah Khamenei. And the people had placards, and it said, Obama, Obama, you are either with them or with us. I'm sorry, I said it the wrong way. You are either with us or you're with them. In Syria, and we did nothing, didn't help them at all. In Syria, they held up the same kind of banners, except if you don't help us, we will all be killed. When they did this, the casualty rate of killings in Syria was 5,400 people. That's when they held up those. It was in the city of Homs, H-O-M-S. Now the casualty rate, when you speak of the killings in Syria, is 135,000. From 5,400 when they held up those banners, it's now 135,000 that are dead. Probably more because the United Nations has stopped making any official estimates. It is so high. We could have come in Syria when it was 5,400, and those people would still be alive. They would have been our allies in a fight. But the first thing that we do when we talk about any conflict, and I heard the Secretary of Defense, Hagel, say it regarding Iraq, because Iraq right now is lost. I'll go to that, but I want to make this particular point. The first thing he said, no boots on the ground. Why do you tell your enemy what you won't do? I'm not saying there should be boots on the ground. I'm saying you don't tell your enemy what you should do, what you're going to do. President Obama started out his presidency telling our enemies what we're going to do. We're going to leave Iraq, and we're going to leave Afghanistan in 2014. Well, when you are in the service, you learn the first week in basic training, if you're ever captured by an enemy, you may give your name, your rank, and your serial number. Nothing else. Boy, that's ingrained in your head. Now, our commander-in-chief tells our enemy that we're fighting what we're going to do. That's going a little bit above the name, ranks, and serial number categories. But that is the way that it's being operated now. A guy like Putin, which you asked about, God, he sees this, and I don't think he understands it at all. I don't understand it. A lot of people don't understand it. Putin acts like the commander-in-chief of Russia. He acts like he's the president of Russia. President Obama, by those who preceded him, does not act like the president of the United States when there are foreign conflicts. If I may, I don't mean to make a speech, but I just want to mention this because I mentioned Iraq. He said, we've ended the war in Iraq. No, we haven't. We surrendered in Iraq. We haven't ended the war. It has just been taken over, or I shouldn't say taken over, but black flags are now flying outside government institutions in Fallujah and Ramadi. Jeez, that's Anbar province. Anbar province is about 1/3 of the country of Iraq. We fought like the devil, and by we, I mean our service personnel, house to house fighting. And we were way ahead when we went out, way ahead when we left. And now we lost. I think it's important. I'll sum this up in this way. You do not end a war. You win it or you lose it. And Winston Churchill said, you do not win wars by evacuation. We evacuated.
In a recent Wall Street Journal column, Peggy Noonan, former Reagan speechwriter, said that President Putin of Russia wanted a Nixon that he could negotiate with. Now, there's several areas, critical areas right now. One being NSA leaker Edward Snowden, the other being Syria and the Ukraine. Would President Nixon want to negotiate, you think? Do you think he'd want to negotiate with a person like Putin? Or would he want for the forces of democracy to win out?
You know, I always take it very seriously when people ask, what would President Nixon do? And I never want to be presumptuous enough to know with precision what he would do in a particular situation, although some of them are terribly easy. But in this case, my guess would be that since during the Ford administration, he saw Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos go down the drain after he had negotiated, and it was by a negotiation. The negotiation was tremendous. It was a victory. We won. We won again, I'm sorry, and I apologize for a long answer, but I got to, because it would depend what part of his life you might have been referring to in terms of what would he do. Towards the latter part of his life, particularly after he was out of the White House, and he saw that what he did with the Paris Peace Accords were just discarded by the 94th Congress of the United States. Let me just give you a brief summary. Part of the Paris Peace Accord said that if North Vietnam ever violated them, we would come to South Vietnam's rescue, piece by piece kind of refurbishment of anything that they lost. If they lost a bullet, we'd give them a bullet. If they lost a helicopter, we'd give them a helicopter. In other words, any time that North Vietnam would violate this agreement, we would make sure that South Vietnam would be in shape to take care of itself. Okay, when President Nixon left office, first thing that the North Vietnamese did was test out President Ford. And they took a village, a little one. We didn't do anything. Took a bigger one, didn't do anything. Took another bigger, then took all of An Lac province. We didn't do anything. That signaled they could win this war. All they had to do now was go into Saigon. We weren't going to do anything. And they were right. They were right. Now, I'm not blaming President Ford. I'm just saying that he was up against a Congress that would not give him the money. On April the 10th of 1975, primetime television, he gave a speech to a joint session of the Congress, pleading with them to keep the word of the United States, that in 1972, 2¼ years earlier, we had pledged that we would take care of South Vietnam if there were violations by North Vietnam. And the Congress was not giving the money necessary so that we could keep our word. President Ford was begging for that money right away. They wouldn't do it. I mentioned April 10th, not just to give a period of history, but because 7 days later, a week later, April 17, Cambodia surrendered. April the 30th, South Vietnam surrendered. When President Nixon saw this, he had a different feeling, I think, than he ever did about negotiations. Certainly, he felt we was taking care of North Vietnam violating it, but not the Congress of the United States violating an accord. But they did. The 94th Congress did. So I would say if he was asked afterwards if he would negotiate, my guess would be no. Because in doing it, there are too many risks. I don't know of one time in my lifetime that we have negotiated with a tyranny and had it work out in our interest. Not once. Not any single time. It always worked out, against our interests. And the only time it ever worked within our interest is when we negotiate with a friend or a semi-friend. Sometimes it can. When I say semi-friend, in other words, not an enemy, not a real antagonist, but someone who we can't necessarily count on all the time. But that is what I think his conclusion would be after 1975, after he had that experience of seeing what happened with South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos.
Are there exceptions to that rule?
No.
Like when, for example, when President Nixon went to China in 1972, or when he met with Ceausescu earlier as sort of a setup to go to China. Are there instances in which you believe that we can talk to people of a totalitarian or authoritarian nature?
Talk to, but not negotiate. He didn't negotiate with the People's Republic of China. There was the Shanghai Communique, but the Shanghai Communique, which everyone thinks or talks about as though it was negotiation, was nothing. Read it. It is a declaration of what our side believes and what their side believes. It says, and none of it did he ever give Taiwan to the People's Republic of China. None of it. It's worth reading because it isn't a negotiation. It's a statement of facts that he could have written in D.C. and Mao could have written in Beijing, but they wrote it together. And but it wasn't a negotiation. It was when I told you before that Brezhnev had great respect for President Nixon, but respect is one thing. Sticking to your word is another. And I don't think that you can trust those people. And certainly Mao Zedong would be considered a total totalitarian, as much as totalitarian as anyone could be. And President Nixon was certainly aware of that. So he didn't negotiate. There's no negotiation that took place. Conversation, yes. And the Shanghai Communique, which really was a declaration of really the differences between the People's Republic and the United States.
During the 1968 campaign, President Nixon believed that American strength should be kept at a proper level so as to have sufficient negotiating power with the Soviets. How would he define those proper levels today?
Totally different than he did at the time. You know, one thing that I'd sort of like to emphasize is that when our Congress violated our own accord, it made a tremendous difference to President Nixon. I think that it made so much of a difference that he would have been much more cautious if he were still president at that time, much more cautious than he was in earlier years of his presidency. As I mentioned, this all happened after the president was out of the White House with our Congress, our 94th Congress. But he would be different after that experience. Vietnam was very big for two presidents. Actually, it was for four presidents. It was Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. And when you speak of particularly Johnson and Nixon, they're almost one of the first thoughts is Vietnam. You just do, that's all. But then to have that happen after getting exactly the success that you wanted, just really, it bothered him tremendously. And I can certainly understand why. After South Vietnam surrendered, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Fulbright, said, I am no more concerned, or I am no more depressed than I would be if Arkansas lost a football game to Texas. So the Congress didn't care. And a lot of people in the United States didn't care. That brought about over 1 million boat people from South Vietnam. It brought, and there's still 500,000 underneath the South China Sea that never made it. And in Cambodia, genocide. 1/4 of their population dead because the other side won. North Vietnam won won over South Vietnam, and Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge, won in Cambodia. Those people who said peace now, they got it.
President Nixon also said in the '68 campaign, he spoke of the priorities of national security policy. If he were alive today, what do you think his conditions would be before committing troops to a foreign war?
That we're going to win. That it's going to be victory. Exactly what FDR did for World War II. We're going to win. It's victory. Look at every speech that FDR made during World War II. He never talks about a timeline. No one ever asked him. Never talked about leaving. One word, And it's the same with Winston Churchill. Victory. Beethoven's Fifth, ... That was the symbol of World War II. And no one in the United States said, when are they going to come home? It was, we are going to win. And that would be, I think, precisely, if talking about a new conflict, that would be the criterion. Are we going to win, or are we going to try to figure out a way to just sort of gently get out of there? It would be absolutely victory or nothing. I have heard President Obama any number of times saying Afghanistan is our longest war. Recently, I heard Secretary of Defense say it too. It's our longest war. It makes people in the United States feel that this war in Afghanistan has got to end. After all, it's our longest war. It's a psychological thing. I am convinced that people in the administration simply cannot count. It is not the longest war. The first casualty in Vietnam was in 1956 under President Eisenhower. It went through Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and that's where it ended, except that the surrender came in Ford's administration. But we're talking about 17 years, not up to Ford, but up to Nixon. 17 years. More, 2.25 years more if you want to add the Ford episode. But we're talking about Nixon, it was 17 years. And Vietnam was a slice. It was a battleground of the Cold War. The Cold War went on for 47 years. From 1945, ended at the beginning of 1992. So what on earth would give anyone the idea that this is the longest war, Afghanistan? If you don't like the idea of inclusiveness of the Cold War, then okay, I'll give you that. Let's go to Vietnam. And doesn't anyone remember? The answer, obviously, is no. They don't. I don't know when they think, and they started using the phrase when it was 10 years, when we were in Afghanistan for 10 years. They started using the phrase, that's the longest war. It's nonsense.
President Nixon was also cautious about the federal budget, especially in America's commitments and abroad, dollars to foreign aid, to military, and other areas. What do you feel like his priorities were, the conditions were before he would give, he would give out aid to a country?
It would depend on the country. If first, is it allied with the United States? Is it going to be used for purposes that will be helpful to the United States, or is it just only going to be for what we today call nation building? We used to call it national development. It's all the same thing. It isn't to build. One thing that has to be recognized, and I think that we've made a tremendous mistake in both Iraq and Afghanistan. We have tried to win the hearts and minds of those people in countries that we were bombing. You don't do that. You're not going to win the hearts and minds while you're still bombing. You're going to, what we did, again, I have to go back to World War II. I assure you that we did not win the hearts and minds of Germans or Japanese while we were bombing them, for sure. But we did eventually win the hearts and minds afterwards. Because afterwards we weren't bombing, we were using the Marshall Plan to build up their democracies that they made that were tremendously, not only in their interest, but in our interest, to have these countries be democracies. And President Nixon, I know, always felt you can't just say you're going to give X amount to foreign aid and start arguing for it. You've got to talk about it in individual countries. It could be that we should give more to this country and less to this country, or zero to this country. But always talk about it in terms of individual nations, whether or not we're going to give it and how much we're going to give and for what purpose. It would never be just a subject of, well, we'll give more money to foreign aid. Never.
How do you think he would deal with protest movements in countries?
With what?
Protest movements in countries
Protesting?
Like the Green Revolution in Iran. You were talking earlier about the people holding up placards in Iran and Syria. How would he make sure that those forces of peace would win out in those scenarios?
Well, you couldn't. You have to do more than, it would really depend on the circumstance. When they were demonstrating in Tahrir Square against Mubarak, he sure as the devil would not have taken the people at demonstrating's cause. Mubarak was a friend for 30 years, 3 decades. He maintained the peace in the Middle East. He was a tremendous friend. He was not going to go against Mubarak, that's for sure. And nor would any president in my lifetime, I think, have gone against Mubarak other than Carter. Carter probably would have. But Obama did. He did. And that is something where we recently saw, all of us recently saw, 3 successive governments in Egypt. The way that it has been handled would be exactly the opposite, I believe, of how President Nixon would have handled it. This is what we did. The President of the United States, President Obama, said that, I'm paraphrasing, but that Mubarak has to go. We were not on Mubarak's side. Then Morsi took over. Morsi from the Muslim Brotherhood. Our aid increased to Egypt. We really put out our hand to Morsi. He was never for us, ever. I could refer to one statement after another that was very antagonistic towards the United States. Muslim Brotherhood. Then the military took over because there were other demonstrations in Tahrir Square, this time bigger, and they were against Morsi. So the military took over, and the military strongly on our side and trying to stop the violence that was going on in the Sinai by Hezbollah, of extreme risk to Israel. And what did we do? We cut aid to the military government. Cut it. President Obama, in all 3 cases, was on the opposite side of what President Nixon would have been. President Nixon would have been for Mubarak, against Morsi, and for the military, I believe. Obviously, I don't want to be that presumptuous as to say I know, but by God, I'd sure argue on this one. I believe that's what President Nixon would do.
In much more difficult situations, Egypt being very difficult, but in situations where you have more unstable countries like Syria, where the whole country is in a civil war.
It would have been boots on the ground when it was less than 5,400 people who had been killed. After that, it just got to be too much. I think right now, as we're sitting here, it's too late. It's too late. We're going through this negotiation silliness, I believe, regarding al-Assad's government, and only regarding chemical weapons. There's something like 1,400 people who were killed by chemical weapons. It's as though we don't care much about the 135,000 who were killed, but only about those 1,400 because chemical weapons were used. At the same time, the discussions at what are called negotiations, and I suppose are, is now centering around whether al-Assad will stay or not stay. I believe that even though the opposition obviously wants him to leave and might well walk out of the talks if he doesn't leave, I don't believe he's going to leave. I just don't think so. And now I'm just using my opinion, and I just don't see that happening. I think he's using this, as Iran is using it for its nuclear weapons, as a time waster and a focus on things that really aren't going to make much difference. So, and I think negotiations are very dangerous when you're dealing with tyrannies.
How do you get on a track with Iran, who's, as you mentioned, is developing a nuclear weapon? They say they're freezing it, but they have been developing one at a rapid pace.
They'll get a nuclear weapon. They already have all of the materials for it, and we know that. They'll do it whenever they want to do it. It'll probably take them months, but they can do it.
Does President Nixon see a peaceful resolution to that, or does he?
At this stage, I would guess not, because I don't think that there is one at this stage. Look, President Obama has been in the White House now 5 years, a little bit more. They're 5 years further along the line than they were when he started out. And he talked about red lines, and there was no red line. And he talked about red lines with Syria, and there wasn't any. I'll tell you one thing that I do believe about President Obama. I believe that he wishes things were reversed, in that he would have final jurisdiction over domestic policy, and the Congress would have final jurisdiction over foreign policy. It, of course, is the opposite in terms of the Constitution, because on domestic and economic policy, it always has to be judged by the Congress. President can veto, they can override a veto. He cannot override an override. On foreign policy, there can only be one commander-in-chief, not 535 of them. But President Obama doesn't seem to be comfortable thinking about foreign policy. He'd rather have jurisdiction over domestic policy. He'd rather be able to say, we're going to do so-and-so, we're going to do this in healthcare, we're going to do this regarding the IRS. He would rather have jurisdiction over domestic affairs. Over foreign affairs, he wants to give it to the Congress. And we saw this happen. We saw him say that he was going to attack Syria. We saw the next morning say, I'm going to ask Congress. He didn't have to ask Congress, but by gosh, he did ask Congress. But not formally, because the whole thing ended almost as quickly as it began. But he was showing that he wanted the Congress to take over. I will add that a person who I believe is isolationist, and I'm talking about Rand Paul, said that was the best thing, the only thing he ever agreed with Obama, of letting the Congress decide. Dangerous, very dangerous, and very unconstitutional. Look, I mean, a president can't, I shouldn't say unconstitutional, but it derides the authorities that were given in the Constitution. He can if he wants to, but boy, I've never heard of a president who wanted to do that.
Early in his administration, President Nixon saw the opportunity to go to the People's Republic of China and drive a wedge between China and Russia. He called that triangulation. Do you think he would see a similar opportunity today?
What he wanted to achieve was to worry Brezhnev of the Soviet Union, that the United States has become much friendlier with China than they ever were before. After all, he still didn't give them diplomatic relations. President Nixon did not do that. But we were very distant from each other. Any communication was really done covertly. Through our ambassador of Poland, strangely enough, Walter Stessel, was the guy who was doing it sort of covertly with China. And so we were certainly closer than we ever were before. President Nixon's number one was exactly what you said, triangulation, to make Leonid Brezhnev be concerned. Therefore, that would impede the possibility of the Soviet Union and China getting together as partners, as they had been a number of times during the preceding years. They would be close, then they'd be very distant, there'd darn near be a war. Then they'd be close, but he felt if they got as close as they had been at one time, it would be terribly difficult for the United States. He wanted to keep it a triangle, make it a triangle. He was successful in doing that. Today, he would be extremely unhappy to see the amount of cooperation between, there is no Soviet Union, between Russia and the People's Republic of China, with other actors, as they're called, with Syria, with Iran, with North Korea. He would be very unhappy. It worked. Brezhnev got extremely anxious and concerned, And that's exactly what President Nixon wanted with the trip to China. But now it would be it wouldn't be the same because they have gotten together. And that makes it more and more dangerous for the United States.
Taking the current problems, or the recent problems in Libya, especially Benghazi, huge crisis in the Obama administration.
Yes.
How do you think President Nixon would have handled that crisis?
Oh, it would never have happened. If President Nixon were president, that Benghazi would never have happened. He wouldn't allow his State Department to say no to an ambassador who asked for more security. He wouldn't allow his State Department to deny the kinds of things that were denied to Ambassador Stevens for a good, I guess it was a half year of requests. He certainly would have ensured that we did everything in our power to rescue Ambassador Stevens and Sean Smith and Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods. It doesn't appear that we did anything, that we didn't even make a move to try anything. And President Nixon surely would not have had the UN representative who knew nothing about what really went on in Benghazi read talking points that said something that was totally untrue about why this whole thing had happened in Benghazi. You have to go. You could go back to the Yom Kippur War in Israel. President Nixon's instruction to his Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State: give Israel everything it wants now. Get the planes in the air now. I'm paraphrasing, but very close.
President Nixon was a genius in foreign policy. Even people who didn't like him, mainly the Democratic Party, even respected his genius.
Very much so.
In 2016, or elections beyond, do you see a candidate who can match that foreign policy prowess?
Right now, I don't see anyone on the horizon. The only person who I would see on the horizon is a guy who I'm sure is not going to run for president because he decided against it last time, because he knew he couldn't get the money and the organization and all of that, who really knows his stuff. That's John Bolton. I think the man is terrific. I'd like to see him as president. He knows his stuff on foreign policy, and that's the stuff of presidents. Doesn't waste his time talking about things that he won't decide, that the Congress will decide. And so I'd like to see John Bolton. I'm sure there are others who I don't know, but I would say that John Bolton is certainly a foreign policy voice that would be of great credit in that office. What I am very concerned about is the possibility of someone in the Republican Party who's an isolationist. I see that possibility. It used to be, as I mentioned, between World War I and World War II, there was a great block of isolationists. They were Republicans. 1972, they were Democrats. The McGovern slogan was, "Come home, America." That's a rather isolationist slogan. But it was never the Republicans. But now, what happened is, I think what happened is, that the Tea Party, that I love and that did everything right in 2010, was that the election? Yeah,
right,
that was 2010. And they really took over the House of Representatives, and their sole subject was economics. Well, 2010 was not a presidential year. Fine, the Congress does decide those things. And I thought they were out of this world terrific. But then came 2012 and a presidential election. They never got to foreign policy. Never. They still don't discuss it. One guy did, and he won a Senate seat from Kentucky, and that was Rand Paul. Only one who discussed it at all. Well, they saw one of theirs give his view, which was totally different than any. His view is very close to Obama's view regarding foreign policy, frankly. get the devil out of all these places. And they sort of thought, well, this is our view too then, because he's one of our boys. But they're wrong. He is different. He would be a copy of Obama in terms of foreign policy. I think they both feel very much the same. And as I believe I mentioned, that at the time that the president was going to attack Syria, and then he wanted to turn it over to the Congress, Rand Paul said, "This is the only thing on which I agree with." But he doesn't talk about anything else he agrees or disagrees with regarding foreign policy.
If you could pick one virtue or a piece of wisdom in President Nixon's foreign policy vision, what do you think that would be?
Boy, I wish I could just quote a line. I'll think of one as I'm driving home. But I can't think of a particular line. It was, you have to remember that I guess almost every president is engrossed in one particular item of foreign policy. His was Vietnam, Johnson's was Vietnam. You go forward, Carter was the Iranian hostage crisis, Kennedy was Cuba. They all have that, whatever the events happened to be of the time, and President Nixon's was mainly Vietnam. I can't think at the moment that you ask of one particular line that I would say, but I am very much absorbed by knowing his thinking about foreign policy during that period of time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.